Welcome to our second routing guide. This time, we're diving straight into Melee and going over all the regions that you should pick and routes that you can take to really maximize playing Melee in Leagues 4. Now, I do want to go over something that I went over in our Mage guide, which was there are a few really big high priority things that we need to focus on when we craft these routes, right? We need to make sure that when you pick these three regions and pick your combat style, that you're not leaving too much on the table, that you're going to be able to have fun and really utilize those combat relics that you chose. Um, so the first thing that you really want to focus on as we start curating our route here is, does the routes that we pick give you good gear and weapons for your combat style? Because if you are ranging and all you have is a Dorgishan crossbow, you are not going to be having nearly as much fun as somebody who is T-bow blasting, right? So you really want to make sure you have really good gear that complements the style that you picked. You want to lean into that style, okay? Secondly, you want to make sure there's bosses that you can kill with your style, right? If everything is like Zulra or Leviathan, where you can't hit it with melee even if you try, and then you choose melee, you're not going to have a lot of fun killing those bosses for your tasks, right? You want to make sure that they are things that you can actually kill. And then ideally, that are actually weak to your combat style. So ideally, we find things that using melee on is beneficial already in the main game, and then we lean into that even more, and then those kills are really, really fast and really, really fun. Then we also want to go over the skills. It's really important to make sure that you don't leave any skills out of your route, because if you just forget that, oh, I need to train farming and I have 0 farming patches in all of my regions, it's gonna be really tough to get farming up. And there's a lot of tasks that are just associated with getting your base levels. Hitting something like base 70s will be a task, or base 90s, or even maxing, right, is pretty worthwhile to do. And you want to make sure that you can cover all your bases there. And then lastly, you just want to make sure you're not giving up anything too big. In the Mage Guide, we used the example of Kandarin, where you had the Torture and Occult, and that was a big give up in order to drop that to go to take something else. So it's just something to consider, that sometimes there's some like really big heavy hitting items that, even though there might not be a lot of other content, it might still be worth going those regions for that type of thing. With all that said, let's jump into our routes. This time, we're just going over 2. So now let's start talking about our routes. So the first route we're going to dive into is your best in-slot gear setup. How can I get the best gear possible for melee and really lead into it full force, 100%? This is what I'm doing, right? And the first start of that is, let's look at the gear. What is the best gear for melee in the game? Well, it's Torva, and you get that in Asgardia. Secondly, we will want to look at weapons, right? Where's the best weapons in the game for melee? Well, that's either Scythe, maybe Fang, a Vernic for sure is your offhand, right? And it's, which case we kind of want to lean into Moritania, because you can use Rapier instead of Fang as well, right? That's a very, very close, like, best in slot. But Scythe is by far and away the best weapon. Now, is there any gear slots that we didn't talk about with those 2 regions that are best? Well, you get Primordial Boots in Asgardia, you get Infernal Cape in your starter regions, you get the Blood Fury in Moritania. So the only slots that we don't have are a Blessing, which you can get from Clues, or like Zaya if you want to go for that Blessing for your ammo slot, and then your Ring, which is a Fremenic item because you want the Berserker Ring. And unfortunately, you can't actually get the Ultar Ring without taking exactly 3 regions, which is kind of unfortunate that you have to take exactly Desert Fremenic Zaya in order to get that ring, which makes it unfeasible for leagues, I think. I don't think anybody will go exactly those 3 routes. I'm sure somebody will, but it's definitely not ideal. So we're going to assume that Berserker Ring I, which is just a Fremenic unlock, is going to be the best ring that we have. So we only really have Fremenic as like our best in slot items. But the other thing to consider is your offensive prayers. If you take Kandarin, you also get Torture, which is comparable to Blood Fury, depending on whether you want the sustain versus the extra damage, right? Both are kind of interchangeable depending on what content you're doing. but you also get Piety, which is massive. And Piety and Berserker Ring, honestly, I think are relatively close in how much of a damage increase it is, going from I have no ring to Berserker Eye, and going from the slightly worse prayers to Piety, right? So we have a couple an option there. So Asgardia and Mortania are pretty solidified, and then it's a matter of, do we want Kandarin or do we want Fremennik? So let's go down the list again, right? What's the next step in our priority? Well, which of these has better bosses for us to kill, right? What's going to be more fun? Well, Asgardia has tons of God of War's dungeon bosses. Everything but Kree can be meleeed. And then Mauritania, basically everything there can also be meleeed. So melee is very, very strong for both of those. Now, when you look at Kandarin doesn't really have anything for you to melee. You can technically melee Thermi, I guess, which is fine, but like it doesn't have much bossing, so you're not getting really any benefit from a leading into and utilizing the best gear in the game that you just grinded for, right? Meanwhile, you have Fremennik, which you have the Dagonoth Kings that you can melee. You can do a step back melee Musfa method. Which are really the bosses here, right? You have Musfa and then the DKs. Because we don't have Desert, we don't have access to Duke, unfortunately, so you can't melee him. But those are kind of the kind of things to consider. Is you do get a little bit more PVM value out of Fremennik with this gear setup. So it's still pretty close, though. I don't think either of those really, this is by far and away the better one. So let's look at skilling. Is there something that we're missing skilling wise? Well, Asgardia fixed by itself, Asgardia and honestly Mauritania, because you get the patches there, your farming is set, your woodcutting and fire making are pretty set. You have Sepulcher, so agility is set. You have Motherlode Mine. You have, right, like you have most skills set between Asgardia and Mauritania too. So it's really, really close. There's not anything, honestly, that is 100% you have to take this region or you won't be able to train the skill, even if we don't take, depending on whether we take Kandarin or not, right? Or versus Fremennik, which is a little bit less skilling. The thing that you might struggle with in these regions, honestly, is going to be something like construction and funneling all of your logs. You don't really have a ton of, like, obviously you'll be doing raids and you'll get some resources from that, but really you're going to be gearing for those really high purple chance raids, and which means there's going to be a lot of, not as many white lights as you would expect, which means you're not going to get as much gear and secondary resources for your skills from those raids. And because of that, I actually think it's worthwhile to lean more into Fremennik over Kandarin and go for the Berserker Ring because of something like Kingdom, which lets you really capitalize and passively use all the money and elks you're getting from God War's Dungeon and your raids in Mauritania to really fund that kingdom and push it over the top to really make sure that you're able to do all the different skills you need and really stockpile those passively, so that way you can really focus in on the PVM of the regions you have. So now let's talk about how we're going to order and sequence this routing. So the first thing I like to think of is which of these has the worst like skilling options, because skilling in the early game in leagues is very important. There's a ton of tasks that are all related to like chop X log, burn X thing, make this potion, that type of task in the general list that really helps expedite unlocking other tasks, and you really want to focus in on that early. And unfortunately, Mauritania does not have very many of that. You have a farming patch, but you don't really have any other really skilling. It is not a skilling region. And as such, I think we have to slot that as our third pick. I think we need to come here towards the end of our sequence. And then when we look at Asgardia and Fremennik, they're both actually very close. But I think Asgardia edges it out for me because the availability of things like blue dragons and whatnot to get those early prayer levels, get you into that overhead area around 43 prayer. That way you can actually start jumping in on some of these bosses like the DKs and Musfa, or even potentially some of the easier God Wars dungeon bosses, right? I think really helps snowball you into all this PVM that this route is, as this route is very, very, very PVM focused. As such, I'd probably order these as a Asgarnia into Fremenic into Mauritania type route. From a gear progression standpoint, one thing that is really important to note is in Fremenic, you get access to the leaf-bladed battle axe at a pretty mid-level, early-ish Slayer level, especially after you do the Varrock Museum to help like skyrocket those levels a bit. Getting that battle axe really does allow you to expedite your melee setup very, very quickly. It is the, I want to say, third or fourth best melee weapon with the relic buff in the game. So already you're starting out with a very, very strong melee weapon. You can buy obsidian using Tockle, no problem, which gives you a decent armor set, right? Which is all you really need. You need an okay armor set, you need a good weapon, and then off to the races. You can start doing some of these bosses. You can go camp DKs. You can go camp like Bandos even, right? Go ahead and just jump right into it. Your other gear for your other styles is a little iffy with these regions. This is a all-in melee region where your hope is not to really be doing any other combat style almost ever. You technically have full Arams as like a mage setup with this region. But that's kind of it. You don't have really any other mage gear. You don't get any powered staffs or anything. From a range setup, you actually can get a pretty decent range setup. You can get full Armadillo, you can get a Zerate crossbow, you can get the Zerate fan braces. You actually get the Assembler because Dragon Slayer 2 is auto-completed with Fremenic, an Archer's Ring, right? You actually get the Venerator bow, which will make doing some Slayer with range really, really fast, which is nice. It kind of works like your like barrage in the main game when you do like barrage Slayer. Instead, you can just use the Venerator bow to really expedite those Slayer levels really fast, which is really, really nice for those tasks. And you will have the ability of doing those type of tasks in these regions. So very, very strong. You also get access to Lunars with this region, which means you can cast Vengeance and whatnot in these raids to really amplify your damage even more, which is really cool. It's a nice little combo between everything. And that's kind of the routing that I would take. I would go into Asgarnia. I would rush to unlock Fremenic. I would then start Slayer. You jump into that Slayer grind until you can get that Leaf Bladed Battle Axe. That Leaf Bladed Battle Axe unlocks you to be able to do Musfa God Wars Dungeon. You do some of that until you eventually unlock Mauritania. From there, you can grind out Barrows. Getting a full Darok set is an option here as well if you want to just go Darok slapping everything, which is also a ton of fun, especially with the melee relic. Hitting a crit off of a Darok, like a 1 HP Darok bop, sounds like a lot of damage. Should be a ton of fun. And then once you're kind of situated with your melee setup to a point, I honestly probably like once you get Bandos, and even just still having your leaf bladed sword, or honestly even like a BGS where you can start BGS whacking things. And then jump into your Theater of Bloods and grind out that Rapier and a Vernic and or Scythe, which will then just skyrocket the damage you can do and make everything just super easy mode. So with that all said, let's jump into our second route here. Now, the second route is very special. It's something that is not a meta in the main game at all. It is something that is unique only to leagues because of how interactions work with the melee relic that you can take. With that all said, I do want to introduce you to the second route, the Door. Now, Din's Bulwark is an interesting weapon because most people would say while it goes in the weapon slot, it's just a big shield. It's there to be defensive and to protect you, right? Well, something to note is that the Din's Bulwark has a passive effect that when it is on its pummel style, your strength buff is actually based off of your defense bonuses. So you get more strength for your attack based on how defensive and tanky you are. Now, if you notice with the combat relic, you actually have a 50% buff to all of your defense stats, which in turn turns into like almost a 50% buff to the damage that Din's Bulwark does. The other thing is Din's is a 5-tick weapon, which means it's now a 2-tick weapon because of how the rounding works. So this combination puts it basically on par with scythe damage, depending on what your defensive gear bonuses look like. Now, I do want to note that for this route to really take off and be busted, you need a Din's, which is a rare from Chambers of Xeric. It is going to be a bit of a grind in the early game to get enough gear and setups to do Chambers of Xeric to grind out the door. But once you have it, the world is your oyster. You get to run around and you get to bash everything's face in with a giant door while being so tanky you basically take no damage from anything. It is going to be very strong. You will see people running around with the door, and the door is good. The door is God. Now, that said, how does this actually look like from a routing standpoint? What all can you actually do here that lets you capitalize on using the door? So obviously you have to take Zaya, because without it you can't actually get Din's Bulwark. You have to have Chambers of Xeric unlocked. So we're taking Zaya. The second choice you have to make here for this next region choice is, do you want full Justicer, which is your tankiest armor that you can get, right? Or do you want full Torva, which is very, very tanky, but gives you some base strength bonus itself? I believe Torva will deal slightly more damage overall, even with the extra defense on the Justicar. But if you want to be more tanky and have a little bit more reclined and really take no damage from anything, you can go the Justy route, and it'll be totally reasonable. Both are super, super viable. Just note that if you do go the Moritania route, you are now taking a second raid, which is a big time commitment. But if once you get the door and you're just bashing everything's face in, raids with the door will be a ton of fun. So it's not necessarily a downside, just something to keep in mind. And then for your third region, you actually have a choice of one of three regions here to really supplement what you're doing with the door. The first is Kandarin. This gives you access to Piety, like we talked about with the first route. You technically get the Torture as well, which is very relevant if you don't take Moritania, right? With Moritania, you get the Blood Fury, which is more sustain, more defense, right? Which is what we're looking for. If you don't want to take Kandarin, you also have access to Fremennik, very similar to the last conversation we had for the first route. The access to the Berserker Ring is very, very good. One other thing with Kandarin, actually, that I do want to mention as we start talking about rings, is you actually get access to the Ring of Suffering, which is a very, very good defensive bonusing ring, which is what your damage is scaled off of. So going more defense there is totally fine. Fremennik, again, you get the Berserker Ring. If you want to go the Asgarnia into Fremennik and really do as much damage as possible, be a little bit less tanky, totally fine, great route to choose. And then kind of thirdly, you can actually choose the other one of Asgarnia and Moritania. So if you take Mori, take Asgarnia too, take them both. This lets you have access to the raids of Theater of Blood, as being able to bash all of God Wars dungeon bosses will be a blast. Being able to get like a BGS and then BGSing to make sure that your door is actually hitting with all of its strength bonus will be very, very strong. And they actually complement each other pretty well. And then you can mix and match your Torva and your Justy pieces as you get them to really help you find that middle ground before you have a full set, right? As well as like Bandos kind of filling in the mid-game gear, which will help. So that's the door in a vacuum. That is the general game plan. So now, how do we sequence this, right? Now, I did mention this route is a little awkward for the early and mid-game, right? This is a very late-game driven route where most of your power doesn't come till later on in the route. You are melee, which means you want to get some form of melee weapon relatively early. Now, your options for that are either, if you take Fremennik as a support region, you can go after the Leaf Bladed Battle Axe again, If you don't take Fremenic, you could go to Mauritania and get the Darok set. And those are really the only two really good options that scale well with the with your combat relic. As a last resort, you can always go get a whip, but getting 85 Slayer at that point just for a whip is kind of a long grind early on in leagues before you have most of your gear unlocked anyway. That I probably would avoid going that route, and I would either choose to go after a Darok set early or take Fremenic and go after the Leaf Bladed Battle Axe again. I think personally, I would probably lean towards going towards the Fremenic Leaf Bladed Battle Axe route for the door. Go into Fremi early, unlock your Zaya as like your second region, focus on Slayer, get your Leaf Bladed Battle Axe, take the Battle Axe and use that in Chambers of Xerox, start doing some Chambers raids. That lets you camp melee hand. Leaf Bladed Battle Axe will be plenty good for almost every single boss in the raid, which is very strong. You can just use like a rune crossbow for your Olm Head phase, and then just use whatever fire spell you can on the normal spellbook to really help with the mage hand. Do that for, and really you're just going to start grinding that and trying to complete tasks and unlock your tiers as fast as you can. The thing with this route is you may end up focusing more on skilling than combat early on, which is fine. The reason you're doing that is just to unlock tasks and honestly to unlock relics and get to the highest tier drop rate you possibly can as fast as possible. Making that as your priority changes how you view the game. Instead of raiding in the first couple of days, first week, you might not raid for 3 weeks in this route, right? But you're going to use those 3 weeks to really get to that like tier 6, tier 7 relic, get to that 5x multiplier, and then start doing as much Chambers of Xerox as you possibly can. That is the goal. As soon as you get a Din's Bulwark, you go to Asgarnia, ideally, and use that to get your full Bandos set. You get your full Bandos set, plus Din's, good enough, start sending Theater of Blood or Nex to get your Torva or your Justy set. Once you have all that done, now it's about getting KC, get all the time tasks. You will be cruising through anything you decide to touch. And that's kind of the general game plan here is, again, step 1, prioritize unlocking your best drop rates. Step 2, get a Din. Step 3, get your armor. Step 4, off to the races. Honestly, I think this will be one of the most fun routes that there will be. It just has a lot of prep work to it, and it has an RNG element to it where you can go 2 or 3 times dry on the Din's Bulwark, and it will feel kind of bad that you are just stuck in this lull in a temporary game mode. But once you have it unlocked, man, is it going to be a absolute blast going this route. That all said, I do just want to go over just a quick brief recap again on our 2 routes. Route 1, your best melee setup route. This is your Asgarnia, Mauritania, Kandrin route. This gives you full Torva. This gives you a Torture, Prims, your Infernal Cape. It gives you Scythe and Rapier of Vernic. You get access to Piety. Everything is basically as maxed out as it possibly can be, with the exception of your ring slot, which is a small price to pay in order to have access to all of this other stuff, right? Very, very close second is you can put Fremenic in here, right? To get that ring, but you do in turn lose Piety and Torture, okay? So just things to note, but definitely totally viable. Route 2, the door. Walk around with the Din's Bulwark and bash people's face in. It is the way that God meant us to play old school RuneScape when it was created. This route requires you to take Zaya, so you must be doing Chambers of Xerox, and you're going to be doing it in some pretty wonky gear. The early game for the door is going to be a little bit rough until you get the Din's Bulwark, but once that's unlocked, the whole world opens up. You have the option of taking either Mauritania or Asgarnia for your gear, and then you pick a supporting region, whether it's Mauritania or Asgarnia, whichever one you didn't choose, or like Kandrin or Fremenic to help support and give it that last couple of extra slots and defense bonuses. So both very, very fun. Both should be great. And I can't wait to see what everybody chooses to do with their melee setups.